We're recording live from the Rockefeller Bellagio Center. We have two remarkable women who are going to talk about a really interesting subject, which is biases and stereotypes. And the first person I'd like to introduce is Alexis McGill Johnson. Alexis is an incredible thought leader and bridge builder whose work spans politics, academia, social activism, social strategies. Her career has focused on improving the lives of young people with an emphasis on youth of color. And she's the executive director and founder of an organization called the Perception Institute. And she has really recently worked on some very path-breaking analysis and thinking about how we unpack the question of stereotypes and biases. And her must-read new report is called The Science of Equality, which I would commend to everyone. So welcome, Alexis.
Thank you for having us.
And then we have Ndidi Nwuneli with us. And Ndidi is a wonderful friend and an incredible leader. She's one of Nigeria's most remarkable social entrepreneurs. She's been recognized as one of the World Economic Forum's young global leaders and as the Forbes 20 youngest power women in Africa. After earning degrees from Wharton and Harvard Business School, Ndidi returned to Nigeria to work for McKinsey, and then subsequently she founded Leap Africa, which works across Africa to empower and equip social entrepreneurs. And she also co-founded a food company called ACE Foods, ACE Foods or ACE Foods, which processes nutritious foods, and she's become a spokesperson for the kind of mission-driven business leader that she wants to see more of in Nigeria. So welcome, Ndidi. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. So let's start, Alexis, with you. I wonder if you could ground us a little in this whole idea of the concept of the breakthrough work that you've been doing in bias and stereotypes.
Well, so thank you. The actual work around bias has started, a couple of decades ago by researchers, Tony Greenwald and Masrin Banaji, who came up with this idea of really trying to understand how these negative stereotypes were getting embedded in people's brains. Tony Greenwald, who's based out of the University of Washington, had this idea that he wondered if he could shift the way he perceived bugs over flowers. Like, could he make himself like bugs more than he liked flowers? And I know most people probably prefer flowers over bugs. If you don't, you may be a gardener or something else. But he created this simple test where he would flash pictures of bugs and try to pair them with really pretty words, like beautiful and happy and pleasant. And every time he saw a flower flash, he would try to pair it with ugly words, like, bad and ugly and, horrible. And he could do it, but it would just always take him a little bit longer to make the associations between flower and ugly and bug and pretty. But he could always do flower and pretty and bug and ugly. And that lag time in his ability to kind of do the cross kind of associations is what we now understand to be the basis for what we call implicit bias. That we have these associations that we make very quickly by our automatic, what we call our automatic brains, that are very difficult to override when we are moving very quickly. A really quick exercise, if you want, just to kind of create the experience of the automatic brain in the audience.
Yes.
Okay.
Are you guys ready for this? Okay.
Who rides bicycles here? Anybody ride a bicycle? Okay. Okay, it depends on, okay. So what do we call the radius of a bicycle wheel? Spoke, okay. So as a group, we're gonna shout out the answer, okay? The radius of a wheel is called a
spoke.
I tell you something funny, it's a I don't drink Pepsi, I like
Coke.
The white part of an egg is called a
Yolk.
The white part of an egg is called
the whites.
So your brain sometimes just moves a lot more quickly than you have the ability to stop and create the analysis. And that's kind of what we understand to be the basis of how our automatic brain operates. The challenge is that we use those same quick automatic processes to categorize people very quickly, particularly around issues of social identity, the things that we can see visually. So age, gender, race, those are the things that we, within 150 milliseconds, we're actually creating associations, oftentimes negative, about their character and how they show up. And that's kind of what the work that we try to translate.
That's so interesting. So, Ndidi, I think you've spent your life trying to break stereotypes about what it is like to be a woman in Nigeria, what it's like to be a person of color in the world, what it's like to be a social entrepreneur. And it feels to me like you decided really early on that you were an entrepreneur. Tell us a little bit about if there were not people around you doing that, what made you realize yourself that that's who you were going to be and break these stereotypes?
Well, I think I've always been driven by passion and, in my case, anger about things in the world and what I can do to change them. And actually, it was in a prep school in upstate New York that I had my first experience with bias. We were watching a video in the dorm, and it was about the history of America. And one of the classmates said, you know, America has these problems because of black people. That's why America is where it is today. Black people are subhuman. And I was the only white student in this school. I had just come from Nigeria. Subhuman. I couldn't understand why he would make that claim. And I said, but I have higher SAT scores than you. I mean, what is it about me that makes me subhuman? And he said, oh, you're different, you're African. And that was a shocker. But it made me so angry. And I actually, at that time, decided to start having dinners in the school to break stereotypes. And I had different people come and speak. Sadly, this guy never came to any of our dinners. But I realized from age 16, I was 16 at the time, that it's, where you actually are angry about something, you can do something about it. And so with every social enterprise I've started, I've been motivated by anger about the state of affairs and my conviction that I can do something about it and do it in a sustainable way. And that's really driven my path and drove my path to go back to Africa right after, working here for a few years, working in the US for a few years to say, what can I do to change the landscape?
Right. Were you conscious of the fact that you were breaking stereotypes in the way you present yourself? Yes, tell us.
I think there's a consciousness on a daily basis. First, as an African, as a Nigerian, as a woman, and trust me, there are burdens on all fronts. Nigeria is often viewed in many connotations through a negative lens. Being African also has its own connotations, being a woman, and I carried that burden. And in Nigeria, even within my country, I'm Igbo. And the Igbos were part of the Biafran War. So that's an extra burden, right? We were the Biafra. So I think on a daily basis, I have to break stereotypes. And it's actually very exhausting. And in the business world, it's tough. Women have made tremendous progress, and African women and West African women are known to be the most entrepreneurial and extremely driven, hardworking. But even in that context, on a regular basis, you push and change stereotypes, that you're not just there because of your gender, you're just as intelligent, you're just as capable, that being a wife doesn't make you any less of an entrepreneur, that being a mother doesn't mean you can't be a capable businesswoman, and that you're not there because you have a rich father or a rich uncle or a boyfriend or champion who has gotten you there. So on a regular basis, you're trying to prove your worth. And really, when you walk into a room, in the first 5 minutes, you want to make a really intelligent comment so that they say, oh, okay, she's here because she actually deserves to be here.
Interesting. What are your thoughts about what you're hearing Ndidi say about stereotypes and breaking stereotypes?
Yeah, so a couple things running through my head. The first is just your experience in school, right? That, and I think we have to be careful about the way we use bias. But when I talk about bias, I'm talking largely about implicit bias, these unconscious processes that I just triggered, with the folks to make their automatic brain, the associations they have, like kind of lying in the back of their head, just override whatever their heart, their intent, their value may be around a particular group. What your college friend said, or perhaps not friend, but what the guy at college said to you was very explicit. This is, when you have an association about a group that is completely grounded in conscious, articulate stereotypes about a particular group, that is explicit bias. That's what we, in an individual level, would say, that person actually is holding very racist stereotypes. So you can have a conversation around kind of the explicit side, but also recognize the fact that for a lot of people who don't feel like they ascribe to, hardcore explicit stereotypes, that they actually may still succumb to them because of the images that they've taken in or the experiences that they've taken in largely through media. So that's a difference, right, between the kind of explicit and the implicit. On the burden piece, we all have a social identity, right? Whether and you enumerated a number of social identities, from being Nigerian to being Igbo to being in the U.S. To being a woman of color in the U.S. All of those identities kind of are at play and playing out in all of these various situations. But because we all know the identities that exist about us, it means we become hyper conscious of those identities, particularly when they become salient, when we're one of few or one of only in a room. And the mechanism that our brains try to go into that mode, right? Because think of our brains of like our reptilian brains of always trying to protect us, right? And to make sure that we are safe and secure. Oftentimes when that anxiety happens, we go into levels of fight or flight. We have to be on guard about that level of discrimination. And so when we are conscious of those stereotypes, we are managing both the task at hand, but we're also managing how people are perceiving us engaging in that task at hand. And so that cognitive burden that we see, particularly in workplaces, is that extra layer that can take away from productivity. It can take away from...
Which is what Ndidi's describing right now.
All of that.
She says it's exhausting because she has...
Exactly, but there's a name. It's called stereotype threat. It actually is not
Stereotype
just a burden.
threat.
Yeah, that actually helps us engage in that.
So I think so much of the women's movement is coming up against this issue of implicit bias. So you've studied the science of this. What would you advise for how people can unravel those kind of biases and besides each of us in our own ways fighting those stereotypes? What have you learned about that?
Largely that it's not about our individual practices, right? I mean, I think there's a lot that we can do to make hiring more fair, to screen resumes differently, to have structured interviews, to have Rooney rules where you invite more, ensure that more people who are diverse are seen. But it's really about the systemic work. It's about trying to interrogate each of those processes to make sure that where you have an opportunity to lean into bias, that you are actually navigating that, and where you have an opportunity to lean into identity anxiety, you're also navigating those sorts of things. So thinking about from a systemic way how you're going to do that, and then also how you're going to hold yourself accountable. What's the data set that you're looking up against that's actually going to make meaning of the different interactions that you're shifting?
So let's use Ndidi as an example. And so you run a very large successful business. You run a number of very large successful businesses. How do you, in your own life with your employees, address this question, which you're so hyper aware of? The young women that work for you, the young men, how does that play out?
So it was International Women's Day, March 8th, and we actually had a speaker talk about conscious and unconscious bias. And one of the first things we do every International Women's Day is that we actually have both men and women in the room. And I think it's really important to ensure that men are having these discussions as well and unpacking the biases they have about other women, about their wives, about their own state of affairs, and their role as fathers and husbands. And it was so amazing to see this coming through. And actually, we've now taken it beyond International Women's Day to talk about it during our knowledge sharing exercises every Friday. But one of the things that came through during those discussions is that a bias that I have had, and some of the senior women have in my organization, is that the men who work in organizations with very strong women are men who had strong mothers at home. In fact, in my early days, and in Nigeria you're allowed to ask this, I always ask about family questions, and I want to know your background. Because I realized that some men did not want to take any instructions from me. Meanwhile, I'm the head of the organization. And I just felt, it's my company. If you're going to work here, you better be used to a strong woman telling you, giving you instructions in a very loving way. And if you're going to challenge that and have a problem with that, then you shouldn't be working here. So we actually have more women than men. And in most organizations that I run, we have more women than men. And so we're trying to figure out we have about 50-50, but in some of them, they tilt towards 60. So the challenge for us is how do we ensure that when a man comes in with those biases about a woman being in a position of authority, we can actually, in a loving way, convert them and create an enabling environment for them to change their own perceptions and their mindsets. And that's something I'm doing very consciously. In addition, I'm fortunate to sit on a lot of large boards. And for some of them, I'm the first woman to ever sit on those boards. And it's also changing mindsets. I mean, the first time I got board papers in one of the board meetings, it said, "Dear sirs," and I had to say, now there's a woman.
So you're very often the only woman and the only
and it's
woman of
important
color.
to also ensure that those organizations change, because you have a seat at the table. You have to ensure that there are more women on boards, that there are more women in senior management, and that these organizations are actually celebrating International Women's Day and having these discussions. And I'm so excited to see that happening in some of the organizations I serve on the boards, because I think the privilege to change from the top is a lot easier than bottom up. And when we have that opportunity, we can make change happen.
Right. So I want to jump in for a minute here, because you really said that there's limits to what we can do individually. And I think we have in Ndidi an example of somebody who maybe has a lot of capacity in terms of what she can do individually. But you've said that really it's societal changes that will in many ways address these things. So I'm curious about how do you think society is thinking differently about our capabilities and capacities, or do you think we still have huge biases to overcome?
Oh, I think we have huge biases to overcome, 100%. I often hear the people who say, oh, but my children, they grew up under Obama as president and prominent women running for office, and they don't have any bias. They're totally gender blind and color blind, and they totally get it. And when they get into a position like Ndidi has, they will be absolutely fair in their practice. And then you look at their IAT scores, and they look a lot like my grandmother's IAT.
Their what scores?
I'm sorry, their implicit association scores. They're measures of implicit bias, and they look kind of like a lot like my grandparents' scores. Not because they are, any worse than kind of where, since we're intergenerational, where that generation came from, but because of the quality of the media hasn't shifted so substantively in a way that actually helps us see ourselves differently. We have exceptional examples. We don't have critical mass examples. And so our brain, when we see exceptions, right, and indeed I would say would be an exception in terms of what we've seen in corporate practice, that means that our brain says, oh wait, that's an idea, but the default is still this other piece, and it's hard to use that to overcome. You have to have broad policy shifts. If I could just give one really quick example. So we designed almost exactly a year ago the curriculum for Starbucks when they shut down their stores, 8,000 stores that they shut down after they got into an incident in Philadelphia. Two men were arrested and spent overnight in jail for daring to ask to use the bathroom. And the interesting conversation that we had the month between, I think it happened like April 24th, and we had the sessions on May 29th, in designing that curriculum was, what is going to change fundamentally, systemically in your process to actually make this bias workshop work? Because at best it's going to create awareness. But what you have to do is actually take the power and the discretion away from the individual managers who are going to make those decisions, and to be able to say, you can use the bathroom and you can't. And they came up with a policy around whether or not, who qualifies as a customer. So now everybody's a customer. You've been to Starbucks, you're going to Starbucks, or you one day could use a Starbucks. You all get to have the benefit of being a customer. But it's that policy lens that then shifted how you could apply a different kind of strategy around it. And that's actually where we need the work to go. So it's not that these individual stories don't matter and that individual champions don't matter, because they do exist across the board, but they have to get embedded in a structure in a way that helps us understand that our behavior, because our behavior is responding to that structure, if that makes sense.
Indeed, do you think perceptions of women are changing in Africa and in Nigeria? And I talk to a lot of people that say that you're on billboards across the country, and in many ways you are in a position of leadership to counter some of these stereotypes. So do you think they're changing?
Well, it depends on the day you ask me. So some days I am so optimistic. I mean, we have 3 of our leading banks that have female chairs. We've never had that in the history of Nigeria. But then we have regression in politics, where we went from Minister Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and Obi Ezekwesili to now we literally have next to nobody in government. So we have progressed and regressed. And so for me, I feel like there's a sense of urgency, especially when I look at my daughter. So my daughter is a feminist, and she will not stand for the Nigeria that we have today. And so something is going to have to change. You look at the next generation and the generation after them. She's 12 in June. And you see that they are angry, they know their rights, and they'll defend their rights. And recently I had an incident in my home where my daughter was arguing with the housekeeper. You shouldn't have a double standard about who washes the dishes. My brother should wash the dishes if I'm asked to wash the dishes. And she said, in this house, everybody washes the dishes. And it was such an interesting thing because she told my housekeeper that she was sexist. And so I had to ask for forgiveness. Don't speak to the housekeeper like that. You shouldn't be rude. And she said, why? I have to speak up. And so it was very clear to me that this world is changing. And unless the political rulers, we don't call them leaders, rulers, understand that the world is changing and that they have to actually change, the whole concept of women being in the other room, which is what our current president has espoused, really worries me about a country like Nigeria. So I would say that I feel that we all have a role to play. I think there's a role for policy. I think there's a role for awareness. I also think there's a role for quotas, and quotas where we actually find qualified women to fill those roles actively. And I'm pushing for some of this in the spaces that I have a seat at the table.
We're so lucky to have you. Let's open it up for questions. Yes. Please tell us your name and organization.
Sure, I'm English Saul. I'm with the Saul Family Foundation, and I know you mentioned that there's only so much we can do at an individual level, but the truth is that I'm raising two young, white, privileged boys, and I would love to just hear about any practices or advice you have in your homes, in the way that you operate to, all I want in the world is to raise them to be empathetic, good men. So if you have any thoughts on that, I would really appreciate it.
Great question, Mom.
Yeah, so I'll start, and you actually have a son, so you can see. I have two daughters, and I'm trying to raise them to be to have the same voice as in Ndidi's girls as well. I think that I think this opposition between, and perhaps I created more of a dichotomy than I intended to, between kind of what we need to do interpersonally and what we need to do systemically are not completely disconnected. The larger point is that we are all responding to systems and structures, right? Whether they are patriarchy, whether they are misogyny, whether they are white supremacy, they're all of these kind of constructs. Someone mentioned in one of our sessions, just the water that we're all breathing in. These are all systemic structures that we're responding to. The bias is how the field is social psychology, right? So we're reacting to kind of how society creates these associations. So the best thing you can do as a parent is actually help disrupt the associations. And one of the ways that I think is critically clear, I mean, the science I think has been really compelling on, is essentially intergroup contact, but intergroup contact in a way where you are seeing the person who is different from you in a sustained way, so not just like one trip, one visit, in a positive light. So you're not just bringing them to an event where the conversation is all, is reinforcing kind of the trauma of the harm of that privilege has caused, but you're actually creating a positive interaction around that, even if that's part of the conversation, and that they see each other as peers. Because oftentimes what we do is we create these interactions, particularly with people who are people of color or people of a different class, where we're being, beneficent, in ways where you're still reinforcing the hierarchy in the interaction. You're not seeing them as peers. You're seeing them as beneficiaries, and being humble and having that work. So really thinking about what is the peer interaction, what is the how are you going to sustain that interaction, and how are you going to ensure that it doesn't, and positive doesn't have to mean uncomfortable, or like comfortable rather. It can be positive in a constructively discomfort.
That's good point.
I'll just add to it that it's not an easy thing. It's a struggle, because unfortunately they're living in a society that's broken, and so I'm constantly fighting against the tide, especially with my son. And so one of the things I would suggest is really exposure and constant discussion. So at 8, he came back one day from school and said, "Why is there so much emphasis on girls? It's not fair." And I had to show him some of the statistics and reinforce them over time. Because in his own world, it's like the pie is already getting smaller for boys at 8. And so this concept of we can rise together is something I push everywhere I go. Both genders can rise together. The pie is big enough. And so in his case, making it simple to say, yes, look at the disadvantages that girls have. Now let's lift all genders together, and together you rise. And seeing that equality is, but it's constant reinforcement, modeling, and both of the parents, if you have a husband, have to model that behavior. Otherwise, it's tilted.
Beautifully said. So, Alexis and Ndidi, I'm so honored to have had you with us today. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and the incredible leadership that you are showing in all the parts of the world you are. So thank you so much.